On May 14th, 2000, a Sunday afternoon, a friend and I went to a local multiplex to burn a couple of hours. We'd both heard about this new film that had just opened called Gladiator, and that afternoon turned out to be one of the most memorable I've ever had at the cinema, and movies have been a big part of my life for a very long time. Gladiator truly was spectacular, a groundbreaking film, very, very exciting, which really brought a vision of late imperial Rome to life on the screen in a way that a movie hadn't done for decades. 14 years later, after I'd gone back to school to work on my PhD in history, I got 2 discs in little Netflix envelopes. Yes, they used to come in the mail, which I'd ordered, some picture that I knew little about but sounded interesting, called The Fall of the Roman Empire. I watched the film, which was more than 3 hours, and I was amazed to find myself watching essentially a version of Gladiator that had been made in the 1960s. Same basic characters with a few variations. Alec Guinness played the Richard Harris role, Sophia Loren played the love interest Lucilla, and most surprisingly, Christopher Plummer played the evil Emperor Commodus, the villain of both pictures. This got me very interested, both as a film buff and as a historian. How were these films related? How did I not know that Gladiator was an unofficial and uncredited remake of a film originally made in 1964? And what was the historical basis of the story? Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, the arena, the whole fall of the Western Roman Empire, which was the backdrop of the entire story. Not long ago, when I rewatched Gladiator this summer, 2022, I realized this is the perfect subject for a deep dive historical movie analysis. Are you not entertained? Hi, I'm Sean Munger. I'm a historian and author. I have a doctorate in history, and I teach history courses online and in person, including at my website, seanmunger.com. This is only the second historical movie analysis that I've done here on my channel. The first one was on the film The Last Emperor, was more than 5 years ago and a lot less in-depth than this one's going to be. Since I have been doing long-form videos lately, see my recent ones on the Titanic disaster or the 2-video series on the JFK assassination, I thought I'd take the plunge into Roman history, which I don't often get to do, as well as take the chance to analyze 2 very interesting films from different eras, one of which, only one, is a bona fide classic. So this is going to be a long video, close to 2 hours. As with my other deep dives, what I suggest you do, if you don't want to go through all the way through, is dip in and out of the chapters, which I've labeled with simple subject matter headings. So if you look down on the page for this video, you should see the chapter headings there. I'm going to be talking not just about the films Gladiator and Fall of the Roman Empire, compare and contrast, but also the real history behind these films, the events and people in Roman history that they depict, the broader story that they're a part of, and what that story means, which is nothing less than one of the central events in the history of Western civilization. Now, I recognize that those of you who honored me by clicking on this video, of you, approximately 0.02% of you have ever heard of the 1964 film The Fall of the Roman Empire, much less seen it. And the other 99.98% of you had no idea that this film even existed or that Gladiator was drawn from the same source material. That's all totally fine. I am going to be talking about the 1964 film, though, even despite the obvious fact that it's far less culturally prominent than the more recent one. And I'm going to do that because I think it sheds an interesting light on these subjects. And if nothing else, it's a very unique thought experiment to imagine the Joaquin Phoenix role being played by Christopher Plummer and Maximus being played essentially by a Thunderbird's marionette. Hell, after watching this video, you might even want to see The Fall of the Roman Empire, which is available for rent on Google Play, YouTube Movies, and Apple TV the last time I checked. So before we begin with the substantive history, let me tell you about these films, and I'll start with the more recent one. Both films begin in the Roman Empire in the year 180 CE, and both involve essentially the same quartet of basic characters, 3 of whom were real people from history, and 1 of whom in each film is wholly fictional. Gladiator, a product of DreamWorks SKG Film Studio, that's Steven Spielberg's studio, It was directed by Ridley Scott, famous for his previous pictures Alien, Thelma and Louise, and many more. And it was produced by Douglas Wick, David Franconi, and Branko Lustig, who is incidentally a Holocaust survivor. Gladiator is the story of Roman army commander Maximus Decimus Meridius, who, after winning a great victory against Germanic tribes on Rome's northern frontier, is asked by the dying emperor Marcus Aurelius to succeed him. This pisses off Commodus, Aurelius's evil son, who sends Maximus into exile and has his family killed. Maximus becomes a slave and is recruited as a gladiator, but eventually he makes his way to Rome to try to get revenge for the death of his family. He's assisted in this effort by Lucilla, Commodus' sister, who it is heavily implied is Maximus' former lover. By contrast, The Fall of the Roman Empire, made in 1964, is a much less well-known film. It was a production of Samuel Bronston Productions, distributed by Paramount and produced by Samuel Bronston, and directed by Anthony Mann. This film begins same time, same place, 180 CE, on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. Marcus Aurelius, played by Alec Guinness, is bumped off by corrupt cronies of his scheming son Commodus, played by Christopher Plummer, so that he can inherit the throne. Commodus' foil is another Roman general, played by Stephen Boyd. This is the film's analog to the Maximus character, and yes, he does look like a Thunderbird's marionette. He is explicitly presented as Lucilla's lover. Lucilla is played by legendary Italian screen actress Sophia Loren. While The Fall of the Roman Empire lacks the plot involving gladiators, Livius does enlist Lucilla's help in raising a revolt against Commodus, and Livius and Commodus eventually face off in single gladiatorial combat, exactly as Maximus and Commodus do in the 2000 film. The Fall of the Roman Empire, which was a bomb upon its release in 1964, is very long, very slow, and lacks the quick pace and memorable characterizations of the later film. The makers of Gladiator were clearly aware of this earlier film, but they don't acknowledge it explicitly in the credits or anywhere else. I do understand how the makers of Gladiator could argue that their film is not a remake. The Maximus Gladiator plot is significantly different, but really aside from that, the film's storylines and subject matter are remarkably similar. For purposes of this video, I'm going to treat Gladiator as if it is a remake of The Fall of the Roman Empire. Whether it is or not is really not that relevant, since I'm going to be focusing mostly on the history. Now, before we delve into it, let me say one thing. I am a historian, and whenever a historian gets into the business of reviewing historically themed movies, it usually comes off as automatically critical. Yes, both of these films deviate substantially, and in some cases wildly, from the historical record. But at least in the case of Gladiator, which is one of my all-time favorite films, I don't think historical inaccuracy hurts it very much. In fact, as we'll see later on, a few inaccuracies are actually a vast improvement in terms of whether this would be a watchable or enjoyable film, and obviously it very much is. So, just want to make that clear. I don't demand that Hollywood films be historically accurate. That's never been my position. But I do think that a comparison of these films with the real history of Rome is a great departure point to evaluate both the history and the substance of these movies. If you want another take on this topic, Gladiator specifically, I highly recommend the podcast History by Hollywood, whose very first episode, way back in 2017, was an analysis of Gladiator and compared it to the historical record. In fact, there's a lot of really fun and illuminating material throughout that whole podcast. So let's dive in, and we're going to start by looking at the origins of the films themselves. In 1961, Hollywood director Anthony Mann was in London, having completed the big-budget medieval epic film El Cid, starring Charlton Heston and Sophia Loren. He was in Piccadilly Circus, it was raining, and he couldn't get a cab. So he ducked into a bookstore called Hatchard's, which is still there today, and he was drawn in by a display in the window of a new edition of a very famous book series called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was written in the late 18th century by historian Edward Gibbon. According to interviews he later gave, Mann started paging through the abridged version of the book, which was this version, by the way, and he was immediately absorbed by the story. This is, of course, one of the most famous history books in Western literature. It usually comes in 20 volumes. This is my copy of it. It's actually a particular version than Mann was looking at. But anyway, Mann was looking for another picture to direct, and he thought that there was something there. So Anthony Mann got on a plane to Madrid, which is where he'd made El Cid, and he pitched producer Samuel Bronston, with whom he'd worked on El Cid. He pitched him on another epic film, this one centering on the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. And specifically, he zeroed in on the beginning of that process, which Gibbon had identified as the disastrous reign of the Emperor Commodus, son and successor of Marcus Aurelius. The picture that Mann hatched in his mind that rainy day in 1961 became The Fall of the Roman Empire, which he directed and which was released in March 1964, and promptly sank with a muffled gurgle at the box office. Mann directed only 2 more films before he dropped dead of a heart attack in 1967. Not that much longer after that, in the 1970s, film producer David Franzoni began working on an idea that sparked in his mind, also after reading some history books, specifically a 1958 book about Roman gladiators called We Who Are About to Die, and he also read a translation of an ancient history, Historia Augusta, which is a near-contemporary chronicle of the Western Roman emperors, which is believed by historians to have been written about the 4th century CE. Incidentally, Historia Augusta was one of the major ancient sources relied upon by Gibbon when he wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the late 18th century. Franzoni worked on the script for many years, and then in the late 90s, he had a draft screenplay ready to pitch. Franzoni was definitely aware of the 1964 film The Fall of the Roman Empire, and that the story that he pitched DreamWorks Entertainment in 1996 used many of the same characters and events. But it doesn't seem that Gladiator, which is the title of his project, was intended as a direct remake of this earlier film, although in reality it pretty much is. The key moment in the origin of Gladiator was when Douglas Wick and Walter Parkes, who were producers for DreamWorks, brought the idea to legendary British director Ridley Scott. Wick and Parkes brought with them a print of this very startling painting, which is one of my personal favorites. It's called Pollice Verso, and it was painted in 1872 by Jean-Léon Gérôme, and as you can see, it's absolutely magnificent. It totally transports you to the world of late imperial Rome with all its passion, violence, pageantry, and decadence. This painting had the same effect on Ridley Scott in 1997 that it would later have on me. It absolutely drew him in. He immediately wanted to make the picture, which was the result that Wick and Parkes had in mind. So just as this book in 1961 was the genesis of the 1964 film The Fall of the Roman Empire, this painting, created in 1872, was really one of the major factors in the genesis of the 2000 film Gladiator. One of these films was a flop and had no cultural resonance. The other was a huge hit and became a major cultural touchstone. And they're about the same characters, the same situation, the same basic series of events that occurred in Europe some 1800 years ago. Events that seem to have some sort of unique relevance, a prism through which we, at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries, have chosen to view the extremely complex subject of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, you may wonder why I keep calling it the Western Roman Empire. It's because there was also an Eastern Roman Empire, which did not fall, at least not for another 1,000 years. From the Renaissance on, historians have generally referred to that empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, as Byzantium. I'll mention Byzantium again toward the end of this video, but I wanted you to know, if you didn't already, why we basically have 2 flavors of Roman Empire. A fact that neither film acknowledges, but why would they? Because the split between West and East was still a century off at the time of Commodus's death in 192. Still, I think the prominence of this story in our cultural memory and the unquestionable centrality of the fall of the Western Roman Empire in collective history and identity of Western civilization makes this a highly relevant topic. The fall of Rome overshadows our own civilization, even 1,500 years later. Don't get me started on the subject of climate change, but suffice it to say, I don't think I need to spend much time justifying why discussing the fall of the Western Roman Empire today in 2022 is a worthwhile burn of 2 hours or so on YouTube. So without further ado, let's get started. A title at the opening of Gladiator informs us that in the year 180 AD, even since 2000 it's become more acceptable to call it CE Common Era, anyway, 180 CE, that the Roman Empire was vast, stretching from Britain to North Africa, and that a quarter of the world's population lived under the rule of its emperors. Our first historical question, is this true? The answer is, well, we're not exactly sure, and that's for two good reasons. First, we have no hard and fast figures on exactly how many humans were alive in 180 CE, and second, because national borders as they exist today weren't really a thing at this time, it's harder than you might think to determine how many of those humans were living within a polity that's more or less analogous to what we would today call a country. Guesstimates of the world's population about the year 200 range from 190 million to 256 million. What I heard referenced as a conservative estimate of the population of the Roman Empire at this time is about 65 million, which is exactly 25% of the higher global population figure, 256 million, which would make the Gladiator text spot on. They are right about the geography. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent about the year 117, a few decades before the time that we're talking about. That was the time of the death of the Emperor Trajan. The empire did indeed stretch from Britain to North Africa and completely surrounded the Mediterranean basin. Rome had a fairly tumultuous history, and a couple of prior events are relevant to the context of the films. In Gladiator particularly, there's a lot of talk about Rome's form of government, republic versus an imperial monarchical system. Rome was founded, according to legend, by Romulus and Remus in the year 753 BCE, and was a monarchy with an elected king until 509 BCE. The king was elected by the Senate, a council of tribal nobles with very little other power, until the monarchy was overthrown in 509 BCE and a form of constitutional system developed. This is the Roman Republic, or the Republican period, as it's sometimes called. It was during this Republican period that Rome achieved its greatest military strength and cultural dominance over the Mediterranean region. Then it started to become politically unstable in the 1st century BCE. A series of civil wars began, and the guy who came out on top, you know this already most likely, was Julius Caesar, who proclaimed himself dictator of Rome. He was famously assassinated in 44 BCE. Before a group of senators used him as a human pincushion, Caesar adopted his son and heir, Gaius Octavius, also known as Octavian and better known as Augustus. Julius Caesar was related to Octavian by blood. He was his great uncle. But adoption was very big in Roman society. And if you were adopted, you were considered the child of your adopter for all purposes. So in 27 BCE, the Senate conferred upon Octavian the title of Augustus. He was the first emperor of Rome. And this very large and powerful country transitioned from a republic to an empire with a quasi-monarchical head of government. Now, I say quasi-monarchical because unlike the absolutist monarchies later in European history or the dynasties of China, succession of the emperor of Rome was not always, and not even often, between members of a family related by blood. The usual procedure was that an emperor would choose his successor, oftentimes a trusted advisor or military commander, and then adopt him as his son, regardless of age, thereby setting up the succession. So, for example, Trajan, who I mentioned earlier, was adopted by the previous emperor Nerva, to whom he was not related by blood. So when Nerva died in the year 98 CE, Trajan succeeded him. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, was related to him, but not his biological son. The same procedure happened where Trajan adopted him, and then Hadrian succeeded him upon his adopted father's death. So you see how this works. So in the year 180, the northern frontier of the Roman Empire was marked, at least in Eastern Europe, by the Danube River. The area referred to as Germania in both Gladiator and the Fall of the Roman Empire lay outside of Rome's traditional borders in Central Europe. The main enemies that Roman armies were fighting in this area were two tribes, the Quadi and the Marcomanni. Since both films open with story involving this particular campaign, let's turn there next. One of the reasons why the film Gladiator captivated audiences was that it opens with one of the most spectacular battle scenes ever put on film. There was quite an evolution in the way ancient and medieval warfare was depicted on film throughout the 20th century. That's too long a story to go into, but the big leap forward in the stylistic depiction of this kind of warfare was Orson Welles' 1965 film Chimes at Midnight. That exact style of how the battle scenes were handled was ripped off almost shot for shot 30 years later in a memorable but highly problematic little film called Braveheart, of whose anti-Semitic garbage human director and star I will not deign to speak. Suffice it to say, Welles did it first in 1965, Garbage Human made it a big thing in 1995, and then Ridley Scott's Gladiator represented the next notching up of this cinematic technique. Incidentally, the fall of the Roman Empire also contains this same battle scene, a huge dust-up between the Romans and the Germanic barbarians on the frontier, but as this film just barely preceded Chimes at Midnight, it's your pretty standard issue 1950s, 60s ancient battle scene. A lot of British character actors yelling and waving swords around and some horses galloping in one direction or another. So if it's depicted in both films, albeit in very different ways, there must be some historical basis to it, right? Well, yes and no. The simplest answer is that there was not one big battle against Germanic tribes, principally the Marcomanni and Quadi, and their allies, the Iazyges. There was a long campaign of wars between the Romans and these tribes north of the Danube, who had previously enjoyed trade and some measure of peaceful coexistence with the Romans. But in 166, several tribes invaded Roman territory. There seems to have been a lot of population movement and migration within Europe during this period, possibly driven by climate change or other environmental factors. Marcus Aurelius, who came to the throne in 161, dispatched various military expeditions to go deal with this problem. But it was tricky because a major smallpox epidemic called the Antonine Plague was going on at the same time. Put a pin in that idea, it's going to come back later. Now, the story of these wars is very complex. Suffice it to say, each side won some and they lost some, and there were treaties and such that tried to keep peace between them, but these treaties never really lasted very long. There were some major battles, such as a very big one in April 179 on the territory of what is now the nation of Slovenia. But both films, Gladiator and Fall of the Roman Empire, make it seem like there was one huge decisive engagement that settled things for all time in Rome's favor. That really didn't happen. You can see why the filmmakers chose to do it this way. It's both a narrative shorthand, one big battle is easy to film and very dramatic, and it's also a good way to establish the Livius/Maximus character as the guy who wins all the marbles, and thus the hero. The wars against these tribes were not concluded at the time of Marcus Aurelius' death. The campaigns in this area were still going on when Aurelius keeled over in March of 180. This is contrary to what both movies imply, which is that the war was over and that Rome had decisively won it, and that just is not the case. As between the two films, the fall of the Roman Empire comes a bit closer, in my opinion, to historical reality. The first half of this 3-hour-plus film takes place mostly at the emperor's winter headquarters, which is supposed to be along the Danube. It was Vindobona, which is now Vienna. This massive and really impressive set was built in the Sierra de Guadarrama mountains north of Madrid in Spain, and part of the reason why the picture is so slow is because Anthony Mann was trying to squeeze as much utility out of this gigantic and expensive set as possible. While the set looks more medieval than Roman to me, on a conceptual level, it's probably a bit closer to reality, in the sense that the Romans had large forts set up all across this frontier to try to keep a lid on the unrest up in that area. Gladiator depicts the Roman army as being set up in tents. The tent city that they show in one of Ridley Scott's trademark snow falling without accumulation scenes looks a lot more to me like the US Civil War than Roman times. Camping in tents rather than fixed forts would have left this army, which was on hostile territory much of the time, completely open and vulnerable to an enemy that was indigenous to the area, that knew the territory better and probably had better control of local resources and populations that they could draw support from. So perhaps thankfully, I'm not going to get into the technical anachronisms on display in Gladiator, the kind of helmets that the Roman soldiers wear, which I've read were a century or so out of date, or in some cases never existed at all. I'm not going to talk about the horses and the saddles and the flaming catapults and arrows and that sort of thing. That's not really what I do. The go-to guy for that sort of thing here on YouTube, particularly weaponry and technology of the Roman Empire, is Metatron, who does all kinds of stuff like that on his very good channel. And he also has a cool Italian accent. I'm a big picture guy. I can't tell one kind of Roman legionnaire helmet from another. The only other thing that I will point out is that the second major battle scene that occurs in the fall of the Roman Empire, the fight between the legions and the barbarians early in the film's second half, this is after the intermission, this battle scene is considerably worse than the first one in terms of anachronisms. So if you look closely at this battle scene, you can clearly see costumes made of modern synthetic fabrics flapping around with obviously machine-sewn seams. Yeah, they didn't have polyester in 180 CE. There's all kinds of fun examples of these anachronisms in period pictures. I even spotted a wristwatch in Gladiator. But anyway, I digress. While not really the central character, the personality that hangs over both films, the sort of Obi-Wan Kenobi figure, is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Now, it's fitting that he's a Kenobi-like figure because in The Fall of the Roman Empire, he's played by the same guy, Alec Guinness, and in the remake, the role went to Richard Harris. Now, I'll talk about both of those actors briefly at the end of this chapter. But first, who was the real Marcus Aurelius? If you've been to Rome, you may have seen his spiffy little statue of him on a horse. It's at the Piazza del Campidoglio, which was designed by Michelangelo himself. But be careful, that statue is a copy. The original, which does date from Roman times, is in the Capitoline Museum. Anyway, Marcus Aurelius, a superstar in the pantheon of Roman emperors, lived from 121 to 180, and his reverential rump warmed the imperial throne from 161 until his death. He was the son of a nephew of the Emperor Hadrian. He lived a very scholarly life and was brought up as a patrician. Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius as his successor in 138, on the understanding that Antoninus would adopt Marcus Aurelius as his successor, which he did. What often happened among Roman emperors, this was also continued by the Byzantines, was that a reigning emperor would designate his successor as a co-ruler, especially when the senior ruler got old or was afraid that he wasn't going to live much longer. This is what happened with Antoninus and Marcus Aurelius. They were co-rulers, and then Antoninus croaked in 161. The Senate was about to acclaim Aurelius as the sole emperor, but he insisted on sharing power with Lucius Verus, who was both Marcus Aurelius's brother by adoption and his son-in-law. He was married to Lucilla, Marcus Aurelius's daughter. It's a little bit confusing. Now, just a word of caution here. A character named Lucius Verus does appear in Gladiator. He's the kid, played by Spencer Treat Clark, who today is 35, I might add. Now there's a depressing thought. Anyway, that Lucius Verus, who did really exist, is not the same Lucius Verus that I'm talking about, who was his father. The elder Lucius Verus was a co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius until the elder Lucius's death in 166, possibly from smallpox. That death left Aurelius as the sole emperor for a while at least. Curiously, much of Aurelius's glowing historical reputation is based not on his political achievements, but his intellectual ones. One of the great classical texts that has survived down into modern times is a book originally written in 12 volumes by Marcus Aurelius in Greek, which has come to be known as the Meditations. In fact, the film Fall of the Roman Empire includes a brief scene where Lucilla, Aurelius's daughter, presents copies of her father's writings to the Roman Senate. Intellectual historians have come to characterize Aurelius's philosophy as Stoicism. I won't dispute that, but I do admit that intellectual history kind of bores me a bit, so beyond merely mentioning this as a major cornerstone of this emperor's legacy, I'm just going to leave it at that. The depictions of Aurelius in both films tend to emphasize this philosophical side of him, but there is a lot that they get right. As more closely depicted in Gladiator, Marcus Aurelius did spend a great deal of time on legal and administrative matters, and he cared a lot about the proper functioning of the empire. He's shown in the film as a puttering old man constantly squinting at scrolls and documents. Aside from the age issue, which I'll get to in a moment, it's probably not too far off from the way he must have been. Marcus Aurelius did go on campaign against Germanic tribes, as I mentioned. This war was a major preoccupation of his later reign, but he wasn't a warmonger in the sense that conquest was a major galvanizing force for him. He was, however, chief executive officer of an organization that was held together principally through military force. So there is inevitably a military component to his reign and his legacy. Two things about Marcus Aurelius in real life cut against his portrayal in both Gladiator and the Fall of the Roman Empire. He did, as most emperors of this era did, preside over systematic persecution of Christians. Now, persecution of Christians in Rome is a touchy subject and usually ignites ferocious debates among historians. It did happen, it's not fabricated, but we can't really trust how it looks at first glance in the historical record, because Christianity as an institution has had a vested interest for centuries in playing up the ill treatment of its people under the Roman emperors. To this day, the Colosseum has a cross built into the side of it, which was added in later centuries precisely because of this issue. Local officials, particularly provincial governors, were hot to persecute Christians in their realms. The extent to which these campaigns were bottom-up rather than top-down is the main source of debate among historians. We do know that persecution of Christians increased during Marcus Aurelius's reign. Notably, both Gladiator and the Fall of the Roman Empire assiduously sidestepped this issue. Second thing, for all the good that he supposedly did, Aurelius is known, for example, as the last of the 5 good emperors. Far and away his worst decision was anointing Commodus, his biological son, as his successor. Marcus Aurelius had named Commodus as his successor in 166 and appointed him co-emperor in 177. As I referred to earlier, it was not nearly as common in this period for an emperor to designate his blood-related son as his successor as it was for him to adopt someone unrelated or only distantly related. The last time succession among closely related blood relatives occurred was when the Emperor Vespasian was succeeded by his son Titus in 79 CE, a century before the events in these films. I find it interesting that both the films depict blood primogeniture succession, the idea that the next emperor would be the oldest male heir of the previous one. They both depict that as essentially the default choice, and a default that Marcus Aurelius, as a character, has to make special arrangements to get around. Both films depict Commodus, the son, as having essentially grown up with an expectation that he would eventually be emperor. Much the same way in our own time, the poor Prince Charles has grown old and gray, waiting for his mother, the apparently immortal alien being Elizabeth II, to pass on and let him have his chance. In reality, blood primogeniture succession in the Roman Empire was pretty rare, very far from the default choice, and history makes it clear that Marcus Aurelius did intend his son to succeed him. Given the disaster that Commodus turned out to be, this was not one of Marcus Aurelius's better decisions. Now, a brief word on the actors. In The Fall of the Roman Empire, the role of Marcus Aurelius is played by legendary British actor Alec Guinness. Probably the majority of viewers of this video will be most familiar with Guinness's work in the Star Wars franchise, but if you've never seen another Alec Guinness film that doesn't have robots and stormtroopers, you're totally missing out on one of the greatest actors of stage and screen in the entire 20th century. People forget that Guinness made his bones mostly as a comedic actor in the 1940s and early 50s. Long before Star Wars, his most legendary roles were in the films, usually comedies, made by the British studio Ealing, and in fact they're often called the Ealing comedies. This is stuff like The Lavender Hill Mob and The Man in the White Suit. He played a couple of dramatic roles in the 50s, but as a dramatic actor, he hit major stature with his starring role in David Lean's Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957, for which Guinness won an Academy Award. As good as he is, The Fall of the Roman Empire is not one of Guinness's better performances. He kind of phones it in my opinion. He plays Marcus Aurelius as a kind of wistful intellectual, which was probably somewhat accurate. But a guy who waged war for decades on the frontiers of the empire must also have had a very tough and ruthless side, and I don't get that at all from his performance here. It is, however, age appropriate. The real Aurelius was 58 at the time of his death. Guinness was 49 when he played the role in 1963. In the 2000 remake, the role of Aurelius went to Irish-born actor Richard Harris, who was at a very late stage of his career and his life. He died in 2002. Harris's film career began in 1959, but he catapulted to fame as King Arthur, opposite Vanessa Redgrave's Guinevere, in the 1967 film version of the classic musical Camelot. Ironically, he was considered for the role of Commodus in The Fall of the Roman Empire. Guinness was always kind of British upper crust respectable, a legacy actor. Harris didn't really achieve that status until the very end. He was in Unforgiven in 1992, and he had several other prominent roles in the 90s. After Gladiator, he did 2 turns as the original Professor Dumbledore in the Harry Potter films before his death. That role was then taken over by Michael Gambon in the rest of the film series. My major quibble with Harris's performance as Marcus Aurelius isn't really his fault. He was too old. As I said, the real Marcus Aurelius was only 58. Harris was 69 when his role was shot, and he looks even older, playing the emperor as a feeble old man with a very slender hold on life. Granted, life expectancies were markedly lower in the ancient world, so 58 in 180 CE is definitely not the equivalent of 58 in the 21st century. But his performance makes it seem like he's been on the throne forever, when in reality it was only 19 years. Still, I'm not going to knock the film too hard for this choice. Commodus is also older in the film than he was in real life. You can believe it, he was only 18 when he became emperor. Joaquin Phoenix, who plays him, was 25 when he made Gladiator. Speaking of Commodus, let's move on to him. Commodus is unquestionably the villain of both of these movies, and he appears as a villain in most history books too, most notably the Historia Augusta that I mentioned before, as well as Gibbon's famous history that was the basis for the Fall of the Roman Empire film. Now, whenever you have a figure in history who appears irredeemably bad, some historian out there is going to take to the pages arguing that they aren't as bad as portrayed and that most of the histories of them have been written and slanted by their enemies. You could definitely put a couple of famous Richards in this category, namely the Third and Nixon, and there may be some legitimate arguments for each one. Personally, though, given the sources we have, and ancient Rome is not my primary field of study, so I'm not claiming to be gospel on this, but it's very hard for me to look at the historical figure of Commodus and see anything other than a monster. If anything, the portrayals of this person in both of the films are considerably less bad than what they could have shown. First off, let's get his name out of the way. This person is not named after a toilet. Though I believe that his name and the word commode have the same Latin roots, near as I can tell, thanks Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the usage of the word commode as we understand it first appeared in the English language in 1688. And at least at that time, it more commonly referred to a woman's hairstyle that was popular at that time. So I'm fine with making poop jokes at Commodus's expense, but just understand that the luxury to do that is basically an accident of more recent linguistic history. Commodus was born in the summer of 161, and he was the biological son of Marcus Aurelius and his wife Faustina, who was also Aurelius's first cousin, and who also happened to be the daughter of Antonius Pius, the emperor who came before Marcus Aurelius. Faustina married Marcus Aurelius in 145, and over the course of their marriage, they had an incredible 14 kids. 14, including 3 sets of twins. That's a huge burden to put on a woman in the ancient world. However, of those 14 kids, Commodus was the only male child of Marcus and Faustina who was still alive at the time of Marcus's death in 180. Commodus was one of the sets of twins, but his twin brother Titus died at age 4. In fact, of those 14, boys and girls, only 4 lived into the reign of Commodus himself, and they were all women. Lucilla was, of course, among them. Lucilla was 11 when Commodus was born. Infant and child mortality in ancient Rome was horrendous. Faustina herself did not live to see her son become emperor. She died in 175, 5 years before her husband. Incidentally, in the film, The Fall of the Roman Empire, late in the film, it's revealed that Commodus is really the illegitimate son of a character called Verulus, played by Anthony Quayle, who was Commodus's gladiator bodyguard. This is not as much out of left field as it might seem. There are ancient sources that claim that Faustina was sexually promiscuous, and supposedly she slept with gladiators, who, as I'll talk about later, were big celebrities. When Commodus turned out to be such a terrible emperor, and especially given his passion for gladiatorial games, which curiously the fall of the Roman Empire doesn't hit that hard, people tried to explain this aberration, given how revered his father had been, by suggesting that he wasn't really Aurelius's son, but he had to have been fathered secretly by a gladiator. That's where I think the screenwriters of this particular film got the idea to have a reveal in the picture where Commodus's dad turns out to be somebody else. From a storytelling standpoint, though, it's an inexplicable choice. It's completely irrelevant to the story. They don't even really do very much with it. The character of Verulus gets killed right after the reveal. As far as official Rome was concerned, Commodus was treated as the legitimate biological son of Marcus Aurelius. In fact, he was what the Romans called porphyrogenitus, which means literally born in the purple. This refers to a natural child who is born to an emperor while the emperor is on the throne, and supposedly it means that they're really special snowflakes who are destined to rule or something like that. Commodus turned out to be a scumbag pretty much from birth. He was an unruly, rude, and demanding kid, and he was really spoiled. From the moment he was biologically capable of sex, he kept a harem of women that he went around banging anytime he wanted to. There's a famous story that when he was 12, Commodus went to take a bath. The ancient Romans loved baths, but the water was a little too cold for his taste, so Commodus ordered the execution of the servant who was in charge of his bathroom. Specifically, he wanted the bathroom attendant burned alive as some kind of message. The household staff refused to carry out this order. So they fooled Commodus by throwing a sheepskin into the furnace of the palace, and the stench of burning flesh apparently convinced Commodus that the order had been carried out. Charming story, eh? But Aurelius, the father, clearly did want his son, horrible as he was, to be his successor. On October 12, 166, Marcus Aurelius made Commodus, age 5, his official co-emperor. However, this was a ceremonial position only. There's kind of gradations of co-emperorship. But if you're counting, that meant there were technically 3 emperors on the throne at this time: Aurelius, Lucius Verus, and Commodus. And of course, Lucius Verus died in 169. A couple of years later, in 176, Marcus Aurelius promoted Commodus, then age 15, to the official title of imperator, which really did make him co-emperor. A couple of months later, in January 177, Aurelius browbeat the Senate into appointing Commodus consul of Rome, which they could only do by rescinding temporarily a law that set the minimum age for that office. Later that same year, 177, Marcus Aurelius conferred upon Commodus the title of Augustus, thus finally cementing his succession, his son as his successor. Thus, as I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in Chapter 9, both movies get wrong the issue of Commodus' succession. Not only was Marcus Aurelius not reluctant to have Commodus succeed him as emperor, but he was extremely eager to do so, despite everyone's misgivings about what a little monster this kid turned out to be. The narrative hinge of both films, Fall of the Roman Empire and Gladiator, is that Commodus was an unfit ruler who basically usurps the throne, and the real vision of Marcus Aurelius was something more in keeping with his own tradition of wise and stoic leadership. That is not what happened in real life. I'll have more specifics on Commodus and the utterly awful stuff he did in his reign later in the show in Chapter 14. Let's talk briefly about the actors who played the role. Christopher Plummer took the role of Commodus in The Fall of the Roman Empire. He plays the part with kind of a malignant frivolity. He's evil, but he's clearly having a lot of fun and really enjoying being emperor. I really like this interpretation. It's as good as Joaquin Phoenix is, he's not quite as good as Plummer, who was probably Canada's greatest actor. Plummer's career began in the late 1940s on stage in Ottawa, and a few years later he worked with another up-and-coming young Canadian actor of that same era, William Shatner. When he made this picture, Plummer was 1 year away from his true breakout film role, which was Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music, the biggest blockbuster of all time when it came out in 1965. Plummer notoriously hated this film, and he mocked it as The Sound of Mucus. As good as Plummer was, Oscar Gold eluded him until his very later years. He finally scored Best Supporting Actor in 2011 with the film Beginners. Sadly, we lost Chris Plummer in February 2021. Joaquin Phoenix, who plays Commodus in Gladiator, will probably always be best remembered for his own Oscar-winning role as the Joker in that 2019 film. He was nominated for Best Actor twice before that for playing cult member Freddie Quell in The Master in 2012, and also for playing Johnny Cash in Walk the Line in 2005. But his first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor was for this film, Gladiator. He lost to Benicio del Toro for Traffic. Joaquin Phoenix is great as Commodus, and I do love him in this role, but he's just not as much fun as Christopher Plummer. In my opinion, he has very little chemistry with Connie Nielsen, although he does act very convincingly as a foil for Russell Crowe as the Maximus character. Lucilla is a fascinating character in both films and quite pivotal, being the female lead in each. Her role in Gladiator is a bit smaller than the counterpart portrayal in The Fall of the Roman Empire. In reality, Lucilla was a pretty interesting woman and was deeply involved in the political events of this period. The real Annia Oleria Galeria Lucilla was born between 148 and 150, and she was the eldest child of Marcus Aurelius and Faustina, the eldest one to reach adulthood. When she was 11 years old, Aurelius betrothed her to his co-emperor, adopted brother, and biological cousin, Lucius Verus the Elder. She married him when she was 14. He was 18 years older than she was. Ew. By him, Lucilla had 3 children, the only one of which who survived infancy was Lucius Verus the Younger, the character played by Spencer Treat Clark in Gladiator, and his character is not shown in The Fall of the Roman Empire. The real Lucius Verus the Younger apparently died fairly young, not an infant, but still fairly young, and was apparently not alive during Commodus's reign. As you already know, Lucilla's husband, co-emperor Lucius Verus the Elder, died in 169. She was now a royal widow and daughter of the reigning emperor, who was, as was typical of royal women in the ancient world, now available to be married off to somebody else for political reasons. Aurelius chose to remarry his daughter off to one of his political allies and military commanders, Tiberius Claudius Pomponius, who was born in Syria and had already distinguished himself as a military commander, governor, and member of the Senate. By him, Lucilla had another son, Pompeianus, who also became a senator and who was eventually executed by the Emperor Caracalla in 212 CE. In the film Fall of the Roman Empire, Lucilla, played by Sophia Loren, is the main love interest of the ostensible hero, Livius, the Thunderbird's puppet guy, and the analog to Russell Crowe's character in Gladiator. Interestingly, in the 1964 film, Aurelius does use Lucilla as a chess piece in a political marriage. But the bridegroom here is Sohayemus, the king of Armenia, played by Omar Sharif, who spends most of the film wearing a gold helmet and a miniskirt for some unfathomable reason. Sohayemus was a real person and was sort of a puppet king of the Romans in Armenia, an unreliable one as it turned out, but in real life he was not married to Lucilla. Both films do correctly show Lucilla involved in plots against her brother Commodus, who she recognized after he came to the throne was a disaster and completely unstable. She also strongly disliked Commodus's girlfriend, his consort really, who was named Crispina. However, neither film accurately portrays how the plots unfolded or even who was involved in them. In 182, Lucilla was incensed that Commodus invited Crispina to sit front row at the theater in Lucilla's traditional place. This can't have been the only motive. Obviously, there was political intrigue going on here too. But Lucilla, who was then having an affair with a hot young number named Quintanus, got her lover to try to stab Commodus with a dagger while they were at the theater. So Quintanus made the mistake that all Bond villains make. He wasted time explaining the plot instead of just getting on with killing the guy. In this case, Quintanus said before he struck, "This is what the Senate sends you." Commodus's bodyguards had time to react, and they dragged him away, and poor Quintanus was executed. Commodus used this plot and a secondary conspiracy that was uncovered, which may or may not have really existed, as most dictators in history tend to use plots against them, as an excuse to clean house. Commodus went on a rampage and had numerous officials and advisors executed, most of them holdovers from his father's reign. Lucilla did not escape his wrath. First, he banished her and her family to the island of Capri. Then he sent a hitman to rub her out, which happened later in the year 182. Lucilla's second husband, Claudius Pompeianus, had his reputation blackened by his wife's treachery, and he retired on the pretext of failing eyesight. Lucilla was played in 1964 by the legendary Golden Age of Hollywood actress Sophia Loren, one of the most beautiful women in popular culture in the entire 20th century. I was pleasantly surprised to discover that, as of at least of the time of the recording of this video, Sophia Loren is still alive, soon to be 88, and living in Geneva, Switzerland. Loren, of course, was the star of classic films like Houseboat, Two Women, for which she won an Academy Award in 1960, and Arabesque. In her career, she starred opposite Cary Grant, Gregory Peck, Marlon Brando, Clark Gable, Charlton Heston, Paul Newman, Peter Sellers, and many, many more. She got the role here first because she was a huge star. She was the biggest star in the cast at this time, but she had also worked on El Cid, which, as you recall, had been a previous production by producer Samuel Bronston. In Gladiator, Lucilla is played by Connie Nielsen, a Danish-born actress, who also appeared more recently in several DC Comics films, including the Wonder Woman pictures. Her breakout role was in the ridiculous but entertaining 1997 film The Devil's Advocate, opposite Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino at his shouty finest. Something I did not know about Nielsen is that for several years, she was the romantic partner of Metallica drummer Lars Ulrich, also a Dane, and in fact she had a son with him. Nielsen's performance as Lucilla is more substantive than Sophia Loren's. She does have chemistry with Russell Crowe and sells very well the idea, never really stated in the script but heavily implied, that her character and Maximus are former lovers. She also conveys very well her concern for her son, Lucius Verus the Younger, and her barely disguised revulsion for Commodus. Incidentally, there is no indication in the historical record of any kind of incestuous relationship or desire between Commodus and his real-life sister, Lucilla. After a lot of historical context, we finally get down to the ostensible heroes of these two films. In The Fall of the Roman Empire, it's Gaius Livius, played by Stephen Boyd, and in Gladiator, it's Maximus Decimus Meridius, which is not a genuine Roman name, by the way, but he's played in an Oscar-winning role by Russell Crowe. In both of these films, we, the audience, spend most of our screen time with these two guys. Were they real people? Short answer, no. It's clear to me that these characters were totally fictional. Because Rome was a military society and the emperors employed a lot of generals, you can find a lot of people in this period who I suppose you could claim were inspirations for these characters, but I don't really think they are. These are fictional creations who are meant to serve a particular function in the story. Maximus in Gladiator really is the major part of the story. His character arc goes from victorious Roman general to slave, gladiator, and would-be avenger of his wife and son. As I said in the first chapter, the focus of the film on him and on that story, which does not really have an analog with Fall of the Roman Empire, is why I think the filmmakers could claim that Gladiator is not a remake of that film. Anyway, if you want to talk about a Roman general who might have been one of the inspirations for the character, let me throw one at you. Marcus Nonius Macrinus, who has been claimed to have been an inspiration for the Maximus character, and whose tomb was found just north of Rome in 2008. Nonius Macrinus did serve as a general under two emperors, Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, and he did fight on the frontier. However, after we get past these basic facts, his real-life story departs significantly from the Maximus character. Nonius Macrinus served in the Senate and in various administrative positions. He was wealthy, he died in favor with the emperor, and he may in fact not even have lived into Commodus's reign. What I do find interesting in the Maximus character is that they seem to portray him as much like another famous Roman military leader, Cincinnatus. He, of course, was famous for wanting to return to his farm and live peacefully after his military service was done, and he refused to hold on to power in Rome for this reason, a living exemplar of what's called civic virtue. Early on in Gladiator, Maximus repeats to basically anyone who will listen what he really wants is to return home to his farm in Spain. I should tell you that Cincinnatus lived centuries earlier in the Roman Republic period, and that by 180 CE, military leadership was basically a career choice. So it's more likely that Maximus, if he was such a brilliant general, would have spent most of his adult life in the army. Now, that doesn't mean that he couldn't also have had a big villa in Spain. We see the villa a couple times in the film, and it's obvious that Maximus is very wealthy. But the way that the character comes off is that he sees tending his crops as his primary occupation, as if he was called to the military somewhat against his will. I don't think you could have become Rome's highest-ranking military commander without being a more or less career soldier. Anyway, aside from the Gladiator plot, the character of Livius in The Fall of the Roman Empire is pretty much the same. Big military guy, friend of Marcus Aurelius, and lover of Lucilla. However, the 1964 picture is interesting in that it depicts Livius and Commodus as close friends, presumably to make the sting worse when Commodus turns against him. In Gladiator, Maximus and Commodus clearly know each other, but it's clear that Maximus never liked or trusted him. Let's talk about actors. Livius is played by Stephen Boyd, and I'm convinced he's one of the reasons why the film failed commercially and critically. He's not only the least interesting and least appealing performer in the picture, but he's a vacuum at the center of it. Your attention just wanders away every time he's on the screen because he's just not interesting or engaging at all. It really is like watching a Thunderbirds marionette. Stephen Boyd, a Northern Irish actor, got this role because of his supporting turn in the big-budget Swords and Sandals epic Ben-Hur in 1959, which got critical acclaim and won him a Golden Globe. He was also an early choice to play Mark Antony in Cleopatra in 1963. That role eventually went to Richard Burton. Boyd died of a heart attack, only 45 years old, in 1977. Russell Crowe is much more successful as Maximus. Crowe, originally from New Zealand, has lived and worked mostly in Australia. He rose from bit parts in the early 90s to international prominence at the end of that decade. In 1999, the year he filmed Gladiator, he was nominated for Best Actor for playing tobacco whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand in The Insider. Crowe won the Academy Award for Best Actor for this performance, and honestly, I think he richly deserved it. Now, I have not read the script for Gladiator, but I suspect that this character was really flat and empty on the page. Russell Crowe himself has said that. He worked really hard to bring any sort of characterization at all to the role. The fact that he turned a nothing-on-the-roll page into an Academy Award-winning performance is testament to his incredible talent. The death of Marcus Aurelius in the year 180 is a major event in both films, and it's really the historical event that's focused on in both of them. The transition from Aurelius, the last good emperor, to Commodus, the bad emperor who starts Rome on its final decline. Both films show Aurelius being murdered. In Fall of the Roman Empire, the emperor is poisoned by Commodus's cronies, while in Gladiator, he's killed by Commodus himself. So how did Marcus Aurelius die in real life? The historical consensus is that he perished in a pandemic that bears the name of his dynasty, the Antonine Plague, which was smallpox. This was the first large-scale pandemic to affect the Roman Empire, and it appeared in about 166, the same time that Rome started fighting those wars on the frontier of Germania. China, incidentally, was also affected by smallpox epidemics in this same period. The Roman Empire was a horribly unhealthy society. Clean water was scarce, food was insecure for all but the very richest people, the work in the fields and in the army was hard and brutal, and diseases of all kinds were endemic, especially in urban areas. Rome, by far the largest city in the empire, was a death trap in terms of demographics. Its death rate, mostly from disease, significantly outstripped its birth rate. This epidemic, the Antonine Plague, raged for the last half of the 160s and the entire decade of the 170s. It decimated the Roman armies and made those wars against the Marcomanni and the Quadi tribes that much harder to win. Then, in the late winter of 180, Marcus Aurelius himself came down with it. He was not, as stated in a line in Gladiator, dying for 10 years. As soon as the spots appeared, he knew he was done for, which we know because he sent for Commodus immediately and told him that he'd better bring the wars against the Germanic tribes to a successful conclusion. We're not 100% sure where this happened, but sources seem to favor the theory that Aurelius was in camp at Vindobona, which is now in Vienna, Austria, and Vindobona is in fact mentioned in Gladiator. I've already dealt with the issue of the succession, and I think the historical evidence is very clear that Marcus Aurelius very much wanted Commodus to succeed him. Contemporary Roman historian Herodian wrote an account of the confab at Aurelius' sickbed as he was dying. Supposedly he told them, quote, "Here is my son, whom you brought up, who has just reached the age of adolescence and stands in the need of guides through the tempests and storms of life. You must give my son advice and remind him of what he is hearing now. In this way, you will provide yourselves and everyone else with an excellent emperor, and you will be showing your gratitude to my memory in the best of all ways. Indeed, it is the only way you can keep my memory alive forever." End quote. So, you got that? He really, really wanted Commodus to succeed him. The ideas in Fall of the Roman Empire that he was toying with the idea of throwing Commodus aside, and the depiction in Gladiator that he definitely planned to do so and in fact abolish the office of emperor entirely, is just nonsense. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17th, 180 CE. He was cremated and his ashes returned to Rome, interred in Hadrian's mausoleum, which is now called the Castel St. Angelo in Rome. Of course, there were suggestions that he was murdered, and some Roman sources reference rumors about this, though how the killers were able to make it look like smallpox is left unexplained. It's hard to find a Roman emperor who was not obviously murdered about whom there are not rumors that he was secretly murdered, but in this case, I just don't buy it. In a time with a major epidemic raging which killed between 5 and 10 million people and was the leading cause of death in the Roman Empire at that time, the suggestion that the emperor died of that exact disease should not seem suspicious to anybody. I think it's pretty clear. Marcus Aurelius died of smallpox. You can't tell the historical story of Commodus without talking about gladiators, or the games, as they're usually called in the film, and also in the reality of ancient Rome. Zooming out a bit, it makes total sense that the games were the main form of entertainment in the Roman Empire. This was a highly martial society that measured its success in terms of conquest, and its economy, as we'll see in a minute, was heavily dependent on the products of martial conquest. This was also an extraordinarily violent society. Historians aren't sure exactly where or when the tradition of having people kill each other for public entertainment began in Roman society. It might have started as early as the 4th century BCE and might even have been a holdover from the Etruscans, which were one of the forerunner civilizations to Rome. Certainly, the tradition was well established by the height of the Roman Republic period, and it continued on into the imperial era. Gladiators were entertainers and celebrities, as portrayed in the film. However, also as depicted in the film, to make it work as a major institution, the purveyors of this grotesque form of entertainment needed a lot of people to kill off, the Roman equivalent of red shirts in the old Star Trek series. Thus, the cannon fodder for the games were often slaves, prisoners taken in war, or condemned criminals. We see this in the film Gladiator. Maximus is picked up in Spain by scavengers of some kind, transported to North Africa, and then he comes into the ownership of a lanista, or gladiator owner. That's Proximo, the Oliver Reed character. He is a lanista. In the early days of gladiators, rich private citizens often provided gladiatorial games and other public entertainments called munera as sort of a civic service and also as a business. Now, I'm surprised that the film Gladiator doesn't hit this harder, that this really was a business. There's some talk of it, and Proximo discusses with an imperial official contract rates and that kind of thing. But the games were really a huge deal economically in Rome and also in the provinces. Top gladiators, if they survived, were well paid, and they augmented their income with regular product placements. Now, this is a little hard to imagine, but it's true. In fact, there was even a scene written in the Gladiator script where Maximus was supposed to do a commercial for a particular vendor of olive oil right before one of his matches. And then you're supposed to see the ancient equivalents of billboards around the city advertising olive oil with his endorsement. Apparently, Ridley Scott took this out because he thought no one would believe it. To be sure, not everybody who was defeated in the arena was killed. Obviously some were, but a gladiator who was clearly defeated could essentially appeal to the crowd for mercy. This is the pollice verso, or with a turned thumb, that takes us back to the famous painting that convinced Ridley Scott to get on board the film. The crowd would decide if the winning gladiator should kill the loser or let him, or occasionally her, live. This tradition is depicted in the film, but not accurately, according to some scholars. Believe it or not, it was thumbs up, not thumbs down, that meant that the loser was toast, and the symbol for mercy was more like this. The emperor would not have made the call, as Commodus does in the film. The crowd would have done this. The death toll from these games was utterly insane. Scholars have calculated the chances of a gladiator dying in the arena each time he or she entered at about 1 out of 4 in the late imperial period. Figure 10 shows a day. They were more often one-on-one combat, not always mass melees as depicted in the film, although that did happen. But anyway, let's figure 10 shows a day. That's at least 20 gladiators on stage every day, with 1 out of 4 dead. If Commodus held 150 days of games, as it's said in the film that he plans to, that's 750 people dead right there. Add more for the big mass show events like the mock Battle of Carthage that we see as Maximus's first gig in the big Colosseum in Rome. Some classical scholars have estimated there were over 400 arenas in the empire at the height of the sport, which calculates to about 8,000 dead per year. And about that Colosseum, which is the main stage for gladiatorial combat in the second half of the film, my first impression after seeing the real one in Rome is the one in the movie is too damn small. I mean, the Colosseum is massive. You can't even really get your head around it until you've actually been there. This is a photo of me actually taken in the real building. This was taken in the summer of the year 2000, so Gladiator was in theaters when this picture was taken. And yes, I'm wearing, if you have a sharp eye, I'm wearing a Jay and Silent Bob t-shirt for the record. The Colosseum was constructed on the order of the Emperor Vespasian beginning about 72 CE. The funds used to construct it came from the looting of the Second Temple in Jerusalem during the Jewish-Roman War in the year 70. I am Jewish, so this building, impressive as it is, has something of a negative significance for me for that reason. It was completed under Vespasian's successor, Titus, his son. The seating capacity was somewhere between 50 to 85,000. There was kind of an awning that shielded spectators from the sun, and the design of this awning shown in Gladiator is conjecture. We don't know exactly what its design was, but it's probably a pretty good guess. For the film, they had sailmakers construct these panels. The outside of the Colosseum was sheathed in marble. The reason why there's all those little square holes on the outside of it is because that's how the marble panels were basically held onto the structure. Most of the marble itself was looted during the Middle Ages. You'll note an interesting detail here that the Colosseum was built by the state. So the games were originally provided by private citizens, but then the Roman imperial government eventually co-opted the presentation of the games. And the emperors would have been nuts not to co-opt the games. You've got a mob of 50 to 85,000 Romans all together in one place braying for blood. So if you're the state, you want to control that, or else somebody else will, and they might turn it against the state. Though very popular, some people in Rome, many, were deeply uncomfortable about this bloody spectacle, even in the early days. As you might imagine, the games declined as the empire did, and they became especially hard to stomach after Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE. The institution of the games was mostly gone by the 5th century. That's the same century that the Western Empire fell. As for the East, Byzantium, the staunchly Orthodox Christian version of the empire, their popular entertainment turned mostly to chariot racing. Constantinople's version of the Colosseum was the Hippodrome, but the politically explosive power of public sports and the mobs who followed it continued as Emperor Justinian discovered, quite to his cost, during the Nika riots of 532, which is a subject I don't have time to go into here. Gladiator is an extremely violent film. That's to be expected. I mean, my God, it's literally about violence. But the bloodiness of the film is not gratuitous. Imperial Rome was an extremely violent society. As a historian, it's hard to talk about subjects like this without seeming to pass moral judgment on them. Plenty of writers in the centuries since the fall of the Western Empire have characterized Imperial Rome in moral terms, even Gibbon to some extent. And the idea of the Roman Empire being decadent and especially collapsing because of that decadence, that idea is very deeply rooted in our culture. But Rome was violent in other ways than just the games and their wars. One of the ways that stands out to me is the treatment of its children. There was a huge infant mortality rate in this society, and I already talked about that. But infanticide was one of the leading causes of death. If a Roman woman gave birth to a child, the paterfamilias of the family, the oldest male member of the household, whether he was her husband or father or someone else, but he basically decided whether the child should be allowed to live or else abandoned to die in a public place, a procedure known as exposure. So apparently you could walk around the city of Rome in these times and see dead babies lying around in various places. A pretty horrifying thought. Crime was rampant, especially in urban areas. There was no outdoor street lighting in Rome until centuries later, so going out at night was extremely dangerous. Muggers and attackers, some drunk, waited in the shadows to beat or rob unsuspecting people. Violence of many kinds was endemic in Roman society. Reading about ancient Rome, what stands out to me is that life was extremely cheap, and killing and violence were very casual. Recall the story of 12-year-old Commodus demanding that his bathroom attendant be executed for making his bath too cold. Now granted, Commodus seems to have been a psychopath, but that kind of behavior also seems to illustrate the casual way that death and killing were treated in this society. I would not have wanted to live in ancient Rome. For the vast majority of people, life there was, to quote a famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. I want to say a few words about slavery in the Roman Empire. Slaves and slavery are mentioned a couple of times in Gladiator and almost not at all in Fall of the Roman Empire. This is actually pretty astonishing if you think about it, because slavery was literally the entire basis of the Roman economy. First of all, we have to separate slavery in Rome from what most of us immediately think of when we hear the word slavery, that being usually slavery practiced in European colonial empires and the United States from the 16th to the 19th centuries, give or take. Roman slavery was not like that. First of all, it wasn't racially based. Slaves came largely from conquest. Many of them were captives taken in the empire's many wars. This fact is one of the most important things that you can know about Imperial Rome, because it explains in part why they were such a militaristic society. Slaves did most of the work in the empire. Not only farming work, which was the chief source of wealth, land ownership and farming, but slaves were also in the mines and quarries. They were stevedores, loading and unloading ships. They cleaned the streets, and they kept the horses and livestock and raised children. Slaves in Rome also had white-collar occupations, which was pretty uncommon in Atlantic slavery. Roman slaves were clerks, cashiers, bookkeepers, even bankers and real estate agents. Native Romans outsourced almost any work they could to slaves. So if the people doing most of the work in your society are slaves, and slaves come from conquest, what do you have to do to keep society running? More conquest, more wars, bigger armies. It's not just, as Commodus suggests in Gladiator, that people of the empire like victories because of the prestige. Those victories kept the fields producing and the banks loaning and the produce carts rattling into the market squares. It was integral to the functioning of the empire. Now, this may seem contradictory, but slavery was one of the only sectors in Roman society where any kind of social mobility was possible. Slaves could be, and routinely were, manumitted, freed, and once they were, they became Roman citizens. The ones who worked at white-collar trades, the bookkeepers or produce sellers or agents or whatever, they could go into business for themselves using those skills. So it was possible in this time that the course of your life could take you from being a foot soldier in some foreign barbarian army to a defeat and capture in battle, to years working as a slave in some skilled trade, and eventually at the end of your life to being a wealthy businessman or businesswoman. Nowhere else in Roman society was this kind of mobility possible. If you were a wealthy landowner, you stayed wealthy. If you were poor, you stayed poor. Slavery was a means of social mobility. In Gladiator, Maximus becomes a slave by conquest. Almost all gladiators were slaves, which is why they were looked down upon. Proximo explains that he's a former gladiator. He's really lucky to have beaten the odds. And he's also a former slave, mentioning that he was freed by presentation to him of a rudis, a wooden sword. And that is accurate. There's no need to dwell on this subject, but I thought I would mention it because slavery is so critical to understanding Roman society. David Fransoni's idea to build a plot involving gladiators around the accession of the Emperor Commodus is not accidental. In real life, Commodus did appear in the arena, and he was obsessed with gladiators and the games. He saw himself as a gladiator. This was highly problematic, socially speaking, because gladiators were almost always slaves. So the idea of a Roman emperor, the highest citizen of all, entering the arena to fight like a common slave was thought of as highly demeaning. As a child, Commodus seems to have had a fascination with the games. Given what I said about Roman society's culture of violence and Commodus's own spoiled and possibly psychotic nature, it's not that surprising that he became attracted to this kind of thing. His father, Marcus Aurelius, thought that he would grow out of it. Well, he didn't. When he became emperor in 180, he finally had the clout to carry out his gladiator fantasies for real, which he did, especially in later years. Commodus, who as you remember was only 18 when he came to the throne, he saw himself as a great warrior and hunter, but his hunts and battles were always rigged. When he did fight in the arena, he always got a real weapon, while his opponents got wooden or lead swords, and of course they were expected to lose. In addition to rigged combat with other gladiators, Commodus liked to show off his hunting prowess, such as it was. Roman games took a horrendous toll on wildlife, with animals being collected from all over the empire, mainly so they could be slaughtered in arenas, or on some occasions kill human beings, like condemned criminals. This is where the idea of Christians and lions comes from. Commodus did this too, hunting I mean, and he stood on a platform in the Colosseum shooting various animals that ran by. Apparently he had some kind of crescent-shaped weapon that he used to cut the heads off of ostriches. And in one famous incident, he slaughtered a bunch of ostriches and then hinted to the senators who were watching something like, "I could do this to you," while holding up a severed ostrich head. But that smelled good. It's interesting that the film Gladiator shows Commodus directly entering the arena only once to challenge Maximus to combat. In reality, he was there all the time, especially in the last 2 years of his reign. In fact, Commodus appeared in the arena 735 times. And this was something of a financial scam as well, because Commodus charged the Roman state a fee every time he appeared. The Fall of the Roman Empire, the 1964 film, also shows Commodus in combat with the main hero character, Livius, in a very gladiator-like setting. But instead of the Colosseum, it's sort of a phalanx of soldiers who cordon off an area with their shields. I think they did this because they didn't build a Colosseum set for this picture, which seems a little strange given the lavish scope of what they did build. I mean, look at this. They went absolutely nuts with these sets. The film cost $16 million to make in 1964, the equivalent of about $144 million in today's dollars. And just looking at it, you can see where all that money went. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE. Commodus was emperor from that time, March 180, until his own death in late December 192. That's 12 years, a relatively long time, 2/3 of the length of his father's reign. Neither of the films really communicates this space of time, although The Fall of the Roman Empire does it better, suggesting that Commodus is in power for at least a couple of years. Gladiator, on the other hand, makes it seem like he's in charge for a couple of months at most. The historical sources are unanimous that Commodus's 12-year reign was an utter disaster. Most of the accounts trash him for turning his back on his father's policy of pacifying the Germania frontier, though his rejection of Aurelius's program was not total. Before he died, Marcus Aurelius essentially told Commodus to stay the course in Germania and continue the conquest that he, Aurelius, couldn't quite finish. After his father's death, Commodus remained in Germania on the frontier for a few more months. He conducted a quick campaign against the Buri tribe before returning to Rome. Aurelius died in March, and Commodus's triumphant entry into Rome, which is depicted in Gladiator, occurred toward the end of October. It is true that Commodus did not sink significant resources into military campaigns the way that his father had. Indeed, he wasn't much interested in military matters or administrative ones, and he left the running of the state mostly up to lackeys and advisors. Naturally, this is imperial Rome after all, those advisors started plotting against him, which meant that much of Commodus's early reign was consumed by him battling various conspiracies. I already talked about Lucilla's plot of 182. Another advisor who became problematic was Cleander, who Commodus appointed chamberlain. Cleander is actually portrayed in The Fall of the Roman Empire. He's the blind guy, portrayed by Mel Ferrer, who actually kills Marcus Aurelius with a cleverly poisoned apple. Under Commodus, the real Cleander, a former slave who was not blind so far as we know, profited handsomely by selling government offices, and he began to amass power for himself by consolidating the Praetorian Guard, the part of the Roman army that defended the city of Rome. Fearing a threat to his own power, Commodus had Cleander killed in 190 and threw his head to a crowd. Commodus had a long-standing feud with the Senate. Marcus Aurelius liked and trusted the Roman Senate, and under him it was a very class-conscious institution, as it was always meant to be. He appointed senators from the noble landowning classes, and there was in fact a minimum income requirement that kept the Senate basically a club of rich oligarchs. Commodus was much less class-conscious, and he tended to stock the Senate with his friends and cronies, including freedmen, former slaves. Now, this didn't sit well with the aristocratic Senate. The plots of 182 gave Commodus the excuse he needed to purge perceived enemies from all levels of the Roman state. The Senate, never very effectual in imperial times, was basically a spectator gallery from that point onward. He also used them to pass various laws, renaming things after himself. He literally renamed the city of Rome after himself. It was supposed to be called Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana. That would have looked great on a map. He even renamed all the months of the year after himself. I mean, come on, how narcissistic can you get? One of the last straws, though, was his attempts to declare himself a reincarnation of Hercules. Other Roman emperors had tried to associate themselves with the legendary figure of Hercules, but Commodus took it too far. He dressed up in a lion's skin, he carried a club, and he had coins minted that showed that he thought he literally was Hercules, which in Roman mythology was technically a god. So basically, Commodus declared himself a god. This is part of why he had such an obsession with the games and the arena. They demonstrated his prowess, supposedly, as history's greatest warrior. Against slaves with wooden swords, I don't know how that looked. Finally, there were Commodus's incredible depravities and propensities for violence. There are reports that he personally killed people for fun in various grotesque ways, none of which I'll describe because they're really grisly. I mean, this is really sick, disgusting stuff. He brutalized and humiliated anyone he came across who had a physical disability, often making them put on humiliating costumes before killing them. That harem that he had when he was 12, he kept it all throughout his adult life. There was also a harem stocked with men. He also played sick, petty jokes on people, or what he thought were jokes, like inviting people to fancy dinner parties and then forcing them to eat plates of poop. I wish I was making this up. This person was clearly deranged, and he spent his entire life reveling in grotesque, bloody violence. It's hard to imagine a more unpleasant person. This is why both films, Fall of the Roman Empire and Gladiator, considerably understate just how bad Commodus was. Violent as it is, if Ridley Scott had chosen to depict the more extreme traits of Commodus, Gladiator would have been much more like the infamous 1979 film Caligula, which spent a lot of time showing the personal depravities of another similarly psychotic Roman emperor. That would not have made for a fun time at the movies. So, this is a living example of how historical inaccuracy helped make a better movie. As different as they are, the films Fall of the Roman Empire and Gladiator both depict more or less the same ending for the character of Commodus. In each one, he's killed by the hero, Livius or Maximus respectively, during a staged session of single combat. In Gladiator, it's literally the arena, the Colosseum in Rome. In the Fall of the Roman Empire, it's inside a cordon of soldiers, probably because they didn't build a Colosseum set. Again, you might think, with as close as the films align on this point, that this would have some historical validity. It doesn't. Commodus did not die in the arena or in single combat. He was assassinated basically because he made a few too many enemies. In 192, a big fire destroyed much of Rome, which was thought of as a bad omen for Commodus. At this same time, Commodus was biting heavily into the Roman aristocracy by declaring various people enemies of the state and confiscating their personal fortunes. Then there was that whole Hercules thing, which common people started to think had offended the gods, and that might be why they, the gods, sent that fire to punish everybody. In December 192, Commodus announced his intention to proclaim the new year, 193, by appointing himself consul. Now, he'd done that before, but also at the same time, he was going to officially come out as a gladiator. He proclaimed 14 days of games before this as a sort of celebration leading up to it. During this 2-week blood-soaked bacchanalia, the incident with the ostrich slaughter occurred, which I referred to earlier, and Commodus appeared in the Colosseum fighting other gladiators, winning those matches, of course. Marcia, Commodus's mistress and girlfriend, was kind of horrified that he was going to demean himself by officially becoming a gladiator. She tried to talk him out of it. He appealed to 2 of his other advisors, Eclectus and Laetus, but to his surprise, they took Marcia's side. So in a fit of pique, Commodus put all 3 of their names on the death list of executions that he planned to carry out on January 1st. Marcia happened to see the list and saw these names on it. So the three of them, Marcia, Eclectus, and Laetius, realized that they had to bump off the emperor in a hurry if they were going to keep their heads. So they struck on New Year's Eve, December 31, 192. According to the Roman historian Herodian, Marcia slipped poison into Commodus's wine, which he drank while taking a bath that night. The poison didn't work and he barfed it up. At this point, the conspirators enlisted a man named Narcissus, who was Commodus's wrestling coach, a gladiator, and promised him a huge financial reward if he would kill him. So Narcissus strangled Commodus in the bathtub, or by some accounts, in bed. Pertinax, a military commander and prefect, basically the mayor of Rome, roughly analogous, he was tangentially involved in this plot, and he nominally became the emperor on New Year's Day 193. But he reigned only 87 days before he too was assassinated. We have it on fairly strong evidence that this is how Commodus checked out. I can see why neither Anthony Mann nor Ridley Scott chose to show it this way in their pictures. I mean, it's a pretty pathetic ending for your chief villain, being strangled in a bathtub by a professional wrestler. While Commodus's death in the movies is satisfying, especially in Gladiator, it bears no resemblance to what really happened. I get a sense from both films, Fall of the Roman Empire and Gladiator, that the makers assumed that the audience would have some familiarity with what happened to the Roman Empire generally after the events depicted in the films. The 1964 picture begins and ends with short monologues written by historian Will Durant. This is one of Will Durant's many books, but that monologue talks about how the fall of the empire was not an event, but a process that took about 300 years. Commodus was assassinated on New Year's Eve, 192. His death plunged the empire into a short but intense period of political turmoil. The following year, 193, was known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Pertinax, military commander, assassinated. Didius Julianus, who bought the office of emperor, ruled 66 days, assassinated. There were three other claimants to the throne more or less simultaneously as a civil war broke out. Pescennius Niger, defeated in battle, executed. Clodius Albinus, who managed to live until 197, though not as emperor, was also eventually defeated in battle and was either executed or committed suicide. The guy who came out on top, Septimius Severus, managed to tamp things down for a while. He launched a new wave of military conquests and ruled until the year 211. A little while later, another period of anarchy and chaos, this one lasting 50 years, broke out. Historians generally call this the crisis of the 3rd century. That ended when the emperor Diocletian, as an attempt to rein in the chaos, split the Roman Empire into an eastern and western half with separate emperors. Not a bad idea in theory, but it proved to be problematic in practice, because the next ambitious and powerful emperor, Constantine, decided that he wanted the whole cake, and he waged years of war against a whack-a-mole board of rival emperors until he was finally the last one left. Though not his final enemy, Constantine's most important was the Western Emperor Maxentius, whom he defeated at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. Constantine later legalized Christianity and used it as a sort of glue to hold the old pieces of the Roman Empire together. In 330, Constantine decamped from Rome and made a different city on the Bosporus his capital, a place formerly known as Byzantion, which he renamed for himself Constantinople. From that point on, the two halves of the empire, East and West, started to pursue markedly different courses. With much of the focus on the East, the Western Empire declined quickly, especially as it was under increasing pressure from Germanic tribes who were demanding land and citizenship within the old borders of the empire. Those conflicts ultimately spelled doom for the Western Empire. The city of Rome was sacked by the Vandals, a Germanic tribe, in 410, which demonstrated the weakness of what had once been the world's strongest state. The line of Western emperors finally sputtered out in 476 when the last of them, Romulus Augustus, only 14 years old or maybe 16, abdicated and was not replaced. That was truly the fall of the Western Roman Empire, though the dramatic scenes that you see in paintings, like this famous one from 1836, do not depict that specific event, the abdication of Romulus Augustus, but rather a romanticized version of the sack of Rome by the Vandals in 410. This happened, however, only in the West. The Eastern Empire, which later historians would name somewhat erroneously Byzantium, continued on strong for another 1,000 years. Byzantium was extremely weakened when Constantinople was sacked by crusaders from Western Europe, fellow Christians, in 1204, but they limped along for another couple of centuries until the final conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Were the events shown in these movies, the whole shtick with Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, that whole thing, was that really the beginning of this very long process? Edward Gibbon seemed to think so, as did other very old guard historians. Personally, I think you can draw the line anywhere you want, but this period, 180 CE, does have some cultural cachet as being seen as sort of the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, so it's at least a fair argument. Takeaway point, though, Will Durant is absolutely right that the fall of the Roman Empire, even the western half, was a lengthy process. It's hard to encapsulate it, even the seed of it, in a 2.5-hour or 3-hour movie, which necessarily has to deal mostly in shorthand, paraphrases, and archetypes. One of the specific objectives of the film Gladiator, aside from making money, of course, was to return to Hollywood the tradition of what's often called the swords and sandals epics, which were a staple of studio filmmaking in the 1950s and 60s. Indeed, the fall of the Roman Empire was among the last of those kinds of movies, and the fact that it was such a flop is probably part of the reason why they stopped making them. But this is worth a look because it's interesting in both cinema and cultural history. There's a long tradition of ancient and imperial Rome in the movies, but the context in which it came up often involved Christianity. The exemplar of the swords and sandals picture was the 1959 William Wyler film Ben-Hur, itself a remake of an earlier silent era film. Those pictures were both based on the classic 1880 novel Ben-Hur, whose subtitle is A Tale of the Christ, written by former Union Army General and New Mexico Territorial Governor Lew Wallace. But an even earlier film, Quo Vadis, from 1951, also explored similar themes. That story focused in part on the Emperor Nero's persecutions of early Christians, which, as I referred to earlier, has been heavily emphasized in medieval and Romantic era literature concerning Rome. The martyrdom of saints, for example, and the crucifixion of Christ himself, which is depicted, albeit obliquely, in Ben-Hur. The emphasis on Christianity in these films about the Roman Empire was recently satirized in the 2016 Coen brothers film Hail Caesar, which takes place in 1950s Hollywood, which involves a picture evidently of this type, evidently being made as part of the plot. Suffice it to say, biblical themes were pretty hot in Hollywood throughout much of its heyday. And if you saw a Roman soldier on screen, chances were at least even money that you were going to get some kind of Christian message, however powerful or diluted it might be. That said, not all the swords and sandals pictures involve Christianity. One of the biggest of the era was Spartacus from 1960, which helped vault Stanley Kubrick's career into the big time. That film takes place before Christ, so there's no Christianity, obviously. And Cleopatra, the big-budget boondoggle from 1963, which almost bankrupted the studio that made it, also involves Romans, but also Egyptians, sort of a 2-for-1. And it was developed as a star vehicle for Elizabeth Taylor. That film isn't bad, really, although Roddy McDowall as Augustus is a little hard to take seriously. So why were they making these kinds of films at that time? The answer's very simple. Television. The rise of TV in the early 50s nearly killed off Hollywood. That and an antitrust ruling that unwound studio ownership from the distribution chain. If you could watch Jackie Gleason or Lucille Ball in the comfort of your living room for free in 1952, why bother going to the movies? Hollywood studios' answer was to start making pictures that far outstripped TV's limited format and budget constraints. Therefore, filmmakers were on the lookout for the biggest spectacles they could imagine, and you see this in the movies of the era. The Circus, Greatest Show on Earth, 1952. The Old Testament, 10 Commandments, 1956. War epics shot on location in Asia, Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. Epic musicals, Gigi, 1958. Stories taking place against the backdrop of the Roman Empire were custom made for this kind of thing. Unfortunately, Anthony Mann and Samuel Bronston, the two main driving forces behind the fall of the Roman Empire, were kind of late to the party. Big budget spectacle was starting to wane about 1963, not least of all because the budgets were getting so big that the failure of one of these pictures could have potentially existential consequences for a studio. That was the problem with Cleopatra, which by the skin of its teeth turned a profit. Bronston, the producer, was hot off the success of El Cid when Anthony Mann pitched him the idea for Fall of the Roman Empire. I told that story at the beginning. But the producer also had another beast in the works, 55 Days at Peking, about the Yihetuan or Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900. Bronston decided to put Roman Empire on hold and make 55 Days instead. I covered 55 Days at Peking on my podcast, Green Screen. Though taking place in China, the film was made in Spain, as were a lot of these kinds of pictures, because labor costs were very low, and Franco, the fascist Spanish dictator, was willing to lend the entire Spanish army to film studios as extras for a little pocket change. So yes, all those legions of troops that you see in the fall of the Roman Empire are actually Spanish army troops. 55 Days was not a success, but Bronston decided to throw the dice on another gargantuan spectacle film, this one, which was already in the development phase. The script took a year to write and at one point was 300 pages long and a total mess. Charlton Heston, who had starred in El Cid and 55 Days, was offered the role of Livius but turned it down. They got Stephen Boyd mainly on the strength of his performance in Ben-Hur. Two major outdoor sets were constructed. Marcus Aurelius's fort at Vindobona, which as I mentioned earlier was built in the mountains outside of Madrid, and the Roman Forum set, constructed at Bronston's studio backlot in Madrid. Filming began in January 1963 and was finished in July. The sets of Fall of the Roman Empire remain to this day the largest outdoor film sets ever constructed. Gladiator also had troubles with its initial production, particularly the script. Russell Crowe was especially dissatisfied with the way his character was shaping up, because few films like this had been made in decades. By the time Gladiator got rolling in the late 90s, costumes and props had to be almost universally created from scratch, whereas in Golden Age of Hollywood times you had studio warehouses full of this kind of stuff. They had to do it all from scratch in Gladiator. Director Ridley Scott essentially filmed 3 movies in 3 different locations. The opening battle scene was shot in England, and the forest that you see in the film was already slated for demolition by the UK's Forestry Commission. Scott persuaded them to let him torch it for the movie. The desert scenes, which included an outdoor reconstruction of the Gladiator arena in Zuccobar, were filmed in Morocco, which has long been a go-to destination for filmmakers in search of dusty desert locales. And finally, the Rome scenes were filmed on sets constructed on the Mediterranean island of Malta. This included a 1/3 size replica of the Colosseum, which was digitally extended using CGI. The filming of the picture in Malta was an inspired decision, in my opinion. When you really go to Rome, especially if you've lived the rest of your life in North America, as I have, one of the things that'll strike you is the quality of the sunlight in the Mediterranean. It comes from a specific angle, and it has just a different look than it does in other parts of the world. The Colosseum scenes, in particular in Gladiator, have exactly the right kind of light and shadow, which not coincidentally heavily resembles Gérôme's original painting, Pollice Verso. You couldn't have gotten that by shooting in LA or on some soundstage in England, or even in Spain, albeit that would have looked much closer. Gladiator was filmed between January and May of 1999. Famously, actor Oliver Reed, who plays Proximo, died of a heart attack during the production before his scenes were finished. Reed was a raging alcoholic, and he had his heart attack in Malta after engaging in a drinking contest with a bunch of British sailors from the HMS Cumberland. What a way to go. But this was par for the course for Oliver Reed if you read about his life. As you may know, Reed's final scene in Gladiator is a CGI double. As similar as they are, and as much as they have to say to one another, the films Fall of the Roman Empire and Gladiator couldn't be more different in how they were received and in the impact they've had on film and popular culture. The Fall of the Roman Empire was a massive and embarrassing flop. It premiered at the London Astoria Theatre on Charing Cross Road on March 27, 1964, and it was screened at the Cannes Film Festival, where Sophia Loren arrived on a chariot to promote it. None of this really helped. The picture, which cost $16 million to make, returned barely a quarter of that, $4.8 million, about the equivalent of $43.4 million today, a fraction of its production budget. Critics generally did not like the film. The New York Times perennial hatchet man, Bosley Crowther, basically chopped the picture up and made sushi out of it, lambasting the script as nonsensical and criticizing the film's failure to find any real human interest in its characters. And other reviews were similar. The suction of the film going under at the box office pulled producer Samuel Bronston down with it. Mere months after the release of Fall of the Roman Empire, he and his studio declared bankruptcy. He made a couple of other smaller films in the 70s and 80s, and he died in 1994. Director Anthony Mann made only 2 more films after this before his death in 1967. Aside from financial disaster, The Fall of the Roman Empire as a movie left very little in the way of legacy. Almost no one remembers it. And the fact that the makers of Gladiator didn't even acknowledge it explicitly as part of their source material is telling. Fortunately, it did not harm the careers of Alec Guinness, Sophia Loren, or Christopher Plummer, but if you watch it, it's easy to see why this film is nearly forgotten today. On the whole, it's pretty dull, and aside from the lavish sets, which are very interesting, it's really not that much fun. By contrast, Gladiator was a cultural phenomenon. The picture was a bit of a financial gamble, costing $103 million to make in the year 2000, and films that expensive, which were not part of tentpole franchises, were already becoming a bit risky at this time. The film premiered May 1st, 2000 at the Samuel Goldwyn Theater in Beverly Hills. When open in general release, it was #1 at the box office and proved a major hit during the summer season, grossing $460 million worldwide. The film racked up 12 Academy Award nominations, winning 5, and would probably have swept the awards if it wasn't competing with Steven Soderbergh's Traffic, which, as good as a picture as it was in 2000, is pretty dated now and has not held up. Gladiator definitely has. The version available for streaming now on Amazon Prime is 4K high def, and it's absolutely magnificent. Furthermore, Gladiator reignited many people's interest in ancient Rome and classical history, which had been largely dormant in popular culture since the 60s. I know of some academics who were inspired to become historians as a result of seeing this film. The success of the HBO series Rome and the regular appearance of Romans in video game franchises and such is, I think, directly attributable to this film. In short, its cultural footprint is very large and very deep. Even with all of its historical inaccuracies, honestly, I'm just fine with that. Gladiator is a great movie and one that I think will endure for the ages. So I hope you enjoyed this deep dive historical movie analysis on two very similar but also very different films, and their relationship to the real history of the late Roman Empire. If you like what I do, the best way to help me is to watch another one of my videos. In the deep dive section, I've got a long essay on the meaning of the Titanic disaster of 1912, and a two-part, very in-depth series on the John F. Kennedy assassination. I also have a number of videos on various nautical topics, including ocean liners, military ships, and nautical mysteries. My new book is out, a crime thriller called The Sun Thief. I have a Patreon, that's at patreon.com/Sean Munger, and you could buy me a coffee. I have a Ko-Fi link in the description. Also in the description is the link to my website, it's just seanmunger.com, where I teach history courses online, both free and paid, on a number of different topics. So please do, for this video, all the stuff you do for a video you like, hit the subscribe button, thumbs up, all of that jazz. I'm planning to do another historical movie analysis soon, so keep your eyes open for that. And thanks, as always, for joining me on another journey into the past.